Renee, welcome everybody to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. I'm excited to talk through it too. Shout out to Renee Johnstone for making me aware of this document on the most recent episode of Saturdays with Renee, which everybody should watch every week. I'm sure actually all of you do because more people watch that show than ours. But anyway, it's good to be with you all. Make sure to take a minute and like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and what else? Share it with folks. Make sure more people can join into the discussion. Um, all right. So today we're going to talk through a few things because really what happened is I started reading the document. My friend Brooke Terpstra sent it to me from Oakland Abolition and Solidarity. Shout out to Brooke. After watching, I had actually missed that part of the live, and then I went back and watched it. The discussion that Renee was having along with Jared Ball and Chuck Modi. Modiano, I guess is his name, but everybody knows him as Modi. But anyway, so great discussion there. And I started reading this thing and I was like, there's there's a little I just started looking at some of the people who were involved as well as the organization ACTA that was promoting this document. So anyways, I'm gonna pull it up so people know what I'm talking about, because if people didn't see that, they are like, what are you talking about right now? All right, so hang on one second. Where did I put it? There we go. All right, so this. Actually, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let me just take one moment. I want to say a couple of things up front. One, rest in power to Khalifa Marcellus Williams. Obviously he was executed on, I believe, Tuesday evening. And, obviously want to shout out all the organizers, including ML Smith, who worked really hard to prevent that outcome. And yeah, it's awful. There was a great post by Hanif Abdurraqib. I think he probably posted it last night. I saw it this morning. That was also on, the problem of appealing to sort of guilt or innocence, and anyways, I encourage people to read that. If you don't follow Hanif on Instagram, he's a really good follow there. And the other thing I wanted to say, one, I want to give a shout out to Unite Here in Philly. They're organizing against Aramark. They get paid at the stadiums in South Philly, the sports stadiums down there. They get paid like $10 an hour to serve $18 beers. Right. So they're on a picket. And so shout out to them. I haven't done enough to research into like all of the demands and everything, but support them in every way. Um, and then I wanted to say quickly, Mamadou Tall, for folks who don't know, has been in a prolonged struggle with Cornell University, which relates to the topic today. Excuse me. And yeah, he's currently being charged like a temporary suspension. It seems like some of the pressure people are putting on Cornell. There's a petition, which somebody can put a link in the chat, or I will find it later, that people can sign. I signed it, even though I don't have the only relationship I have to Cornell is that I spoke there once as part of a panel. But I encourage obviously everybody who does, and even people who do not, to sign it and support him. Um, he's obviously here on a visa. He's I think his citizenship is with the UK, but he's from Gambia. And so anyway, this could lead to deportation, and that was certainly what they were initially trying to kind of impose, and then people have been pushing back. And so fortunately, thus far, that's not the case. They haven't messed with his visa status as of yet, but that could change at any time. And again, this is a result, just so if people who don't know, the this is a result of his solidarity with Palestinians, his role as an organizer, For folks who don't know, he's the host of the Malcolm Effect podcast, which is an excellent podcast. I encourage people to listen to. He recently was on the conversation that my co-host Josh Briand hosted with him and Two Black, where they talked about imperialism and Black liberalism in this moment. Really good discussion. There's a video version of it that's on Black Liberation Media, and audio version that you can find on our platforms, on our audio side, as well as it's on audio versions on YouTube on our page too. So I just wanted to say those things, say those things up front. So, anyways, let's get into this. So this document is something that was, I don't know actually what brought it to Renee's attention. I'm kind of curious about that, but it's it's put out by an organization. It's Equal Space for All, Trustee's Guide to Preventing Encampments and Occupations on Campus. They also have another one on preventing divestment on campus, and it's specific to Palestine. And both of them came out in August, right? So this all came out right before the school year started. So it's an American Council of Trustees and Alumni Institute for Effective Governance. These things are publicly posted on their website. So anyways, I started reading it, so it came out in 95, I mean, there's a lot of organizations like this, and I don't know too much about how big this one is. I think in one of the documents, they say that they have at least 1,600 campuses that are a part of their stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean that much. I've worked with boards before. They may or may not look at stuff that seriously, but I think what people will see when they look at this is that a lot of the policies that they are um, recommending are being implemented, right? And so whether they're coming just from this source or maybe some additional other sources, I don't know, but it's certainly the policy agenda that they are advocating is being adopted at a lot of universities. Um, so yeah, I mean, you can start with like the framing here, right? Of the spring semester of 2024 was a national and international disgrace for American higher education. I don't know. I thought it was the best semester of college that I have seen in my lifetime personally, but that's just me. Um, so anyways, they talk about encampments, occupations of buildings, noisome, which I had to look up, means really smelly, anti-Semitic harassment, and presidents of prestigious universities unable to control their campuses, or explain consistently the principles by which they supposedly govern them, principles is an important thing in here. So this part this is where I started to go into like what's going on here. So it can only be one with shame that one reads the long catalog of anti-Semitic outrages on campus in the English edition of humanitarian and philosopher Bernard Henri Levy's new book, Solitude to Israel or Israel Alone, right? And then he names off a bunch of the campuses that had protests, quotes Henri Levy calling it a mudslide, and then noting the whole world is watching. So first of all, I found that strange. Like, why are you starting this document off not with like some objective statement of facts, like there was this many campuses, there were this many complaints of anti-Semitism. I mean, even if you're coming at this from like a Zionist perspective or whatever, I'm not sure why you start with this philosopher guy. So I like looked into him. I mean, his background is that he was a part of the new philosophers in France. He's a part of the 68 philosophers, which for folks who follow the work of Gabriel Rockhill, he dismantles a lot of these folks, but the folks that Gabriel focuses are typically more left wing than this guy on Bernard Henri Levy's uh, claim to fame is that he was vocally anti-communist and anti-socialist and believed that liberalism in France had to be totally like shorn um, from the communist or socialist movement. And he also uh, Jean-Paul Sartre, who is a mixed bag himself, ended up, I believe, a Zionist at the end of his life, although at a certain point he was pro-Palestinian, he was pro-Algerian, and does the preface to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Um, but he called Bernard Henri Levy a CIA agent. um, and I don't know whether that was hyperbole or whether he actually thought that was the case. But anyways, so I was like, so what is this? And so then I Googled him and I watched some of his videos, right? And he's, as you would expect, like a very Zionist French philosopher. Um, but the funny thing was, like, quite quickly, that then this organization, ACTA, has up a video, and I'm not gonna play this all because it's long and, it's interesting to watch in a very, like, messed up kind of way. But so this is the Levy Forum for Open Discourse. This was held in April of this year. The War Against Israel and Ukraine and the Duty of the Jewish People. He's the guest. All right. This is hosted at the Palm Beach Synagogue. All right. Dinner and reception and then program. And then what you'll see down here is that, let's see, yeah, it's sponsored by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Right. So they sponsored the event. This is their YouTube page, Go ACTA. They only have 1,000 subscribers. Too bad for them. Actually, that's good. So I don't want to give them too much light, but I just want to see real quickly.
The story of Bernard Henri.
So this is the president of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, right? He introduces, like, you can see the context of which they're in. It's a setting. It's a lot of political discussion, which I found really interesting because, here you have a nonprofit organization um, hosting an event at a synagogue with a Zionist philosopher. And then, just because I was curious, I went to the webpage of the Palm Beach synagogue and I looked at their donation section, and not too sure what the efforts on the ground in Israel are. But this I looked into a little bit, and other people can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but what I found was that this is settlements in the West Bank. That's what I was most able to piece together. So, like, you get to one step. I mean, all of this is like, here's donate to embrace, educate, and empower IDF soldiers, right? All of this is obviously support of Israel, match all donations up to 500,000, um, so, which is a lot of money. Um, and so, this is what this synagogue is doing, right? So you have this combination, right, of yeah, the president of ACTA hosting this event at this synagogue that supports West Bank settlements, providing support for the IDF. The whole conversation is about how their congregation and Jewish people as a whole, right, should be supporting Israel right now. It's about advocating on they talk a lot. Bernard Henri Levy has given discussions before Congress about trying to get military aid to Ukraine, also Israel. So there's this twin discussion of Ukraine and Israel, which, I a lot of us would think this is like kind of contradictory or whatever, but the thrust of it from both Henri Levy's perspective, and also, uh, well, I don't want to speak for the president of ACTA because I don't know that he makes it clear. But from Bernard Henri Levy's perspective, is this is a war for Western civilization, right? And these are two fronts of the war for Western civilization, right? Um, and it's all like classical liberalism, and so anyways, I just wanted folks to have that context also as we move into it. We're going to discuss some other things, right? And go back through these documents. But I think that it is wild that this organization, which is a nonprofit organization to educate trustees and alumni about basically good governance and running colleges, is that open in their Zionism and in the kind of ideas that they have around this sort of defense of Western civilization against Islamism is a major theme, but also they're clear on Bernard Henri Levy has this book called The Five Kings. Don't read any of his stuff; it's all terrible. Um, but it's like Iran, Russia, China. Who else is there? I don't know, a couple other things, but right. But it's like it's kind of the classical, like everybody that America hates. It's sort of there. Um, but anyways, like that they're that open about the sort of religious affiliation and the political affiliation and the nonprofit thing. It just having worked in nonprofits for a long time, like normally anyone that I work with would have been like, I don't know if we can even do this because I'm not sure that this like falls within what's allowed for 501c3 law, right? So it's like very upfront. And yeah, I am reading his book actually. I think it's behind my head there. But yeah, Levy doesn't make the cut. Yeah, because he's not a leftist really, right? Is the reason. All right. So moving on here to this document. All right. So, anyways, again, peaceful assembly and freedom of speech are core values of our nation. They're absolutely essential in higher education. Um, oh, I'm jumping down too far now, aren't I? No, I'm not. Okay. But time, manner, and place restrictions ensure campus order are also equally important, and they are protected by precedents in case law. Implementing such restrictions leaves free inquiry, civil discourse, and academic excellence by ensuring that everyone has a right to learn, right? And so, it serves those things. So, and a little more important context is that ACTA also is basically a free speech warrior platform, right? So they have a whole, if you Google the word, or not Google, but they have a search engine on their website. And if you just search woke on their website, right, there's a whole catalog of articles they have against woke ideology. There's also, this history they will set up debates. They're try to show institutions on how to set up debates with controversial thinkers is the way that they frame it. Ann Coulter seems to be one of these people, right? I couldn't verify whether this included like Richard Spencer and Milo and those sort of freaks, but it 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 does include advocacy against like the cancellation of speakers, right? So basically they're trying to platform often far right people on college campuses and to also get universities to adopt policies that will ensure that they can get far right thinkers on college campuses, right? So you have, again, like it's very interesting for these to be the people who are now, on the one hand, they're trying to hold up this principle of free speech, which they've been advocating for quite a while. But now they're saying you need time, manner, and place restrictions, which for people who don't know, that means like regulations, and then get into it a little more in the document about the about how you can engage free speech, right? The time, place, and manner that you can do so. All right. I have some other stuff on that, but I'm going to keep going um, on the document. All right. Um, so then they go into this thing, right? They're um, talking about the stuff that circulated last spring. So, they're talking about things that were circulating online, and this is like it's kind of funny to me because it's just sort of like a lot of these things come out of like anarchist zines and stuff like that, or even stuff that came out of older generations of campus protests and occupation, right? And people just, these kind of tactical things, and like they sort of make it seem like this was this super coordinated outside agitation thing, rather than just, hey, people are looking for ways to protest on campus, and they look to the history of how people protest on campus and people share resources. It's kind of not that big of a deal, right? But so the students and outside activists sharing outside activists again is a theme, the outside agitator theme that they'll come back to. Sharing these guides have stated that their goal is to transform our colleges and universities into platforms to advance their ideological agendas, right? Again, this is fascinating, right? Because ACTA's work is all about advancing their ideological agenda. That's essentially all it's like a libertarian slash classical liberal, like, you know, actually we'll come back to this, but that, Palm Beach, is where obviously that the president, Michael Poliakoff, I believe was his name, um, was hosting that event. But there are also a lot of the people that are on their board, and they're all white except for one person, by the way. Every board member except one person who's a black woman judge, circuit court judge. She's retired now. Um, but a lot of them are from Florida, right? And this agenda, we're probably seeing most prominently adopted by a lot of Florida campuses and through, um, you know, people like DeSantis, right? So, anyways, I just say it's funny that they think that students don't have a role to push what their political or ideological agenda is, but of course, the campus should be a vehicle for you know what they would probably call American values, right? Something like that. Um, So yeah, and then of course they were very concerned about the commencement ceremonies being canceled. That's so funny to me that that's such a big deal. Commencement's the stupidest thing ever. Um, yeah. So again, anti-Semitic threats and harassment. I mean, one thing that's very telling about this document is that there is not one. Maybe we'll come to it later, but I don't recall. I've read it a couple times. I don't believe there is one reference to the harassment of Palestinian students, to the targeting, to the violence that they've been subjected to, to Arab students, to Muslim students, right? It's just not even discussed. There's definitely no discussion of how difficult it is to be going to college while your people are facing genocide, right? This is not even a consideration, but there's no it's not even an attempt like a lot of colleges do to kind of create some sort of equivalency, right, between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It is only focused on the climate of anti-Semitism, and it is direct in making the connections to Palestine, right? And that again will come up again in the divestment discussion later on. Um, all right. Yeah, this was interesting too. So NYU is the first, but probably not the last, to have to settle a lawsuit over the mistreatment of Jewish students. It is imperative to forbid campus encampments. I didn't research that, but I found that fascinating because when NYU is the university that has now made Zionists a protected class, right? Made it a violation of campus policy to basically, I don't know exactly the term that they use, but basically they say that um being anti-Zionist is a cover for being anti-Semitism, right? And so it can't be a protection um for people, right? And so I wonder if that came out of the lawsuit, right? Or their settlement, right? Because they settled, so they had to agree to certain things. So I don't know, but I bet it did. Um So again, they're more than just bad public relations for the institutions. Then they talk about how student harassment is about more than the victims being bullied. Both infringe on the rights of all who are part of the campus to whom trustees are responsible, and they erode public trust. I don't think they erode public trust, but you know, I think administrators and the government imposing certain things on college campuses erodes public trust. I don't think encampments do. Um, so anyways, ensure that the institution has rules in place forbidding encampments and harassment and establishing sanctions for infractions, are permitted to enact reasonable content neutral regulations on the time, place, and manner of protest activity. Examples of constitutionally permissible restrictions include noise limitations, such as the use of bullhorns. I did want to mention that Stephen Osuna and I think four of his colleagues at the Cal State University, they've been hit with time, place, and manner. Um, uh, I don't know what they're called, infractions, right? Um, and they wrote a piece that was about CSU's relationship with Boeing, right, and the involvement of Boeing in the genocide in Gaza, right? It's a good piece. It's on Mondo Weiss. I'll try to grab a link for it. Um, but but they weren't they couldn't go after them for writing the piece directly, right? So they hit them with these time, place, and manner restrictions related to so-called unrelated protest activity. And I don't even know the veracity of the actual uh violations, but these time, place, and manner restrictions also have historically not been used against staff, right, or faculty rather. Um, you know, but even still, they're often not used on campuses. This is sort of like a lot of them have them in place and haven't used them in a long time. And so anyways, they're encouraging universities to adopt these if they don't have them, which is happening in mass at a lot of universities. And then they're encouraging them to use them to go after protest activity. They also include um, caps on how many people may participate in a protest, which certainly seems like a violation of a freedom of assembly, but who am I? The Supreme Court sucks. Um, or on bans of overnight occupation, um, which at one of the campuses, I think this is also at CSU, they actually sent out a thing to faculty that they're not allowed to have camping gear or tents on campus. They sent this to faculty too, right? Not just students. Such regulations to maintain ordered liberty. I love this. This is my favorite sentence. Such regulations to maintain ordered liberty powerfully protect free expression, right? And again, they come back to reestablishing order. Makes me think of Cedric Robinson's Terms of Order. Anyway, um, so yeah, there's more here. This was very interesting to me. They talk about the difference between a peaceful protest and encampment. Is that the latter seeks to commandeer the public space of campus to the exclusion of all else in the community. I mean, this is kind of laughable, like on its face to me, especially with a lot of the encampments that I saw, because far as most of the ones I saw, like they're taking up usually a pretty small area of the university or the quad. It is not as though, obviously, in some cases they did take buildings, but a lot of the encampments in no way disrupted what was going on on the campus community. And I'm not saying that as like a good thing. I'm just saying that as a factual matter, I think that this is just doesn't really work for them. But the purpose of an encampment is to disrupt campus life and encourage confrontation well beyond a symbolic level associated with common protest. Right. So this is, I mean, does anybody think that common protest is supposed to just be symbolic, right? That the role of it is just symbolism. I mean, I mean, nobody who knows anything about protests would suggest that it's good. Like, a lot of times our protests are very symbolic or fairly symbolic, and I don't wanna suggest that that is totally devoid of meaning. I think that, us having symbolic protests and showing symbolic solidarity does offer some level of meaning, but there's a whole tradition, a great rich tradition of protests that is profoundly disruptive and filled with confrontation, and that is not a bad thing. And we'll get back to that in a little bit later on too. Um, Time, place, and manner restrictions, when properly crafted, draw the line between conduct that is and is not permitted. Okay. Then they talk a little bit about private institutions, which they talk about have more flexibility because they don't have to abide by the First Amendment. Um, although they should hold themselves to the spirit of the First Amendment. Private colleges and universities can restrict, they can restrict access, right? This can be useful to prevent outside agitators, right? We saw this. I mean, there's been a lot of campuses that were doing that in the spring already, saying there were private spaces and outsiders weren't welcome in. It was used to basically, in a lot of ways, be a pretext to shut down things at Columbia, as far as I know. And then I know at UPenn they use that as well. Um, this was also interesting because there's a lot of mask bans coming out on campuses, right? They talk about this. Depending on state law, private and some public institutions can ban the wearing of masks. Um, they leave this as opposed to reasons of health, which is stupid because cops are not capable of telling, nor is an administrator capable of telling whether you're wearing a mask to conceal your identity or because you're sick. Like, they're not doctors. Um, This was interesting. Students should know and expect, and they italicized it too, expect that staff will videotape campus events, making it easier to identify students who seek to disrupt the campus. Um, then they go into harassment, which is kind of interesting because they cite the Supreme Court case, which I didn't delve into, but that defines harassment as conduct that is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that so undermines and detracts from the victim's educational experience that the victim students are effectively denied equal access to an institution's resources and opportunities. As such, mildly objectionable speech may be constitutionally protected, but conduct that creates a hostile educational environment is not. I mean, again, this is just fascinating to me from free speech warriors, I have to say, but that's a whole other thing. Um, and then they talk about sanctions should include suspension or expulsion of the most serious offenders. Again, I mentioned earlier the connection to Florida. It comes up a lot, but like a lot of the people who are on the board of ACTA are from universities from Florida. A lot of them are from Miami University. Um, all right. This was a statement by Senator Ben Sasse. I don't know him. I'm sure he's terrible. This is not complicated. The University of Florida is not a daycare, and we do not treat protesters like children. They knew the rules, they broke the rules, and they'll face the consequences. And we also told them that clearly prohibited activities would result in a trespassing order from their police department, barring them from all university properties for 3 years and interim suspension from the university. Um, yeah, they compare it to strong sanctions against plagiarism. But then they say similarly barricading oneself in a campus building, vandalizing campus monuments. There you go, the monument thing that's coming out a lot, or indefinitely commandeering public spaces for one's exclusive use obstructs the function of the institution and deprives others of their rights to use these areas peaceably. Um, they have to, suspend them, review it, adjudicate the matter swiftly. The convoluted processes of student and faculty disciplinary committees often fail to signal to the student body at large that punishment follows violations with certainty. I would think the whole purpose of those processes would be to have some sort of due process, right? Um, allegedly. Um, yeah, and then this is a big thing is like they don't want concessions, right? The optics of de-escalation are a recipe for long-term failure, right? So they're not interested in de-escalating. They talked about Harvard and how bad Harvard was for returning course. Talk about Northwestern, Brown, Rutgers, University of Minnesota have entertained demonstrators' demands, including divestment from Israel. Again, it's just wild how open they are, right? This is not a general set of policies, it's like this is about Palestine and Israel. Um yeah, so anyways, they want to to put this in another word, no sensible campus leader would ever justify the pulling of a fire alarm to express disagreement with what is being said in a classroom. Coercive tactics should never replace discussion and dialogue as a means of persuasion, especially at an institute of higher education. I mean, it's so contradictory. I mean, they don't care, right? But they're saying on one hand that um, that they believe in coercion and repression against any of these tactics, right? But they don't believe in the ability of students to use any sort of force, disruption, um, to try to put pressure on the university to take a moral, um, you know, justified stance, right? They talk about registration. Students should sign a form committing themselves to obey and honor the institution's code of conduct. That's pretty standard to my recollection, but in this context, I'm sure it's going to include all of these new rules, right? If they are new. This is where I'm going to talk about a little bit in a minute, the Calvin report on institutional neutrality. So they're big on this, and they're big on this from the free speech warrior side as well as on the divestment side, as well as um, on this side of encampments and so on. And so that's very interesting, especially when given the history of the Calvin report, which I delved into a little bit. I'm still trying to understand some of it, but my sense is it really was not intended to be used for those purposes. Um, anyways, the point that they're saying though is that colleges and presidents are coming under increasing pressure to use the imprimatur of their office to support or decry ideological or political causes external to the university's mission. The best way to avoid this is an unequivocal policy of remaining neutral as an institution on political matters. I mean, gets into the very convenient myth of neutrality that we'll get to a little bit more. But, anyways, it talks about some of the schools that have adopted this. Financial and divestment policies are not matters to be decided by campus pressure groups. Institutions of higher learning or higher education are not political tools, except for capitalism and liberalism, right? And imperialism. All right. Anyways, then they talk about University Stanford has a statement on investment responsibility. Which this is a thing, so I think a lot of people are probably coming up against this at universities, is this discourse around fiduciary responsibility. All right, I'm gonna diagnose and address the root causes of intolerance, two distinct problems, a demonstrator's commitment to transform universities into political tools for advancing their own particular agendas. Um, and it's funny, you get back to their disregard. This is again the disregard for appeals to civil discourse. So because you don't want to have Richard Spencer and Ann Coulter on your campus, it means that you don't want to have civil discourse on things, right? There's actually been a lack of discourse really about the genocide in Palestine on college campuses, at least allowed by the institutions. Um, All right. Anyway, I think this is enough of this document. You can get into more. This is an interesting thing. To what extent are our efforts to promote a diverse and inclusive environment being counterproductive? Are our diversity, equity, and inclusion officers contributing to the problem by fomenting a narrative that pits affinity groups against one another in an oppressor versus oppressed paradigm that may contribute to the alienation of Jewish students? If so, an audit of DEI policies and programs would be in order. This is interesting because there's the whole right-wing attack on DEI. Folks know that, you know, I mean, even from the work I've done with Dylan Rodriguez and conversations I've had with Josh over the year, that in many ways I see DEI as a kind of liberal counterinsurgency effort. Um, but it's interesting because it does deal with discussions of marginalization, of oppression, right? And that's problematic when you have a group of people who are supporting settler colonialism. And actually, I think there's a specific reference to settler colonialism um, in this document. No, it's not here. It's in another one of their um, documentations. They're against the promotion of the idea of settler colonialism, basically. Um, which is always funny to me because, like, Zionists were quite clear early on that they were settlers. Um, all right, so that's the first document. And again, like, people can, their website is goacta.org. People can, play around on there, and there's all kinds of wild stuff. Um, so yeah, I see a question here from Phoenix. Why don't Americans do a tax strike? We cry about our tax dollars, but we still pay them. It doesn't make sense. So it's a good question. When I was working at Making Worlds, there was a good tax resistance um, program that they did, and maybe I'll try to get somebody on to talk about that because it is an interesting thing, and there are actually ways. I think a lot of it has to do that people are afraid that they're going to get charged with tax evasion, right, which is a felony. Obviously that's a decision people would have to make of whether they want to do something that could lead to those kind of consequences. But there's a way to do tax resistance that um, limits how exposed you are to that possibility. So that would be an interesting conversation to have on the show at some point, so people could learn a little bit more about that. Um, uh, yeah, it is. It's totally. It's 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 wild. I mean, it reads like something written by the far right, for sure. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna do the Calvin report thing next, but I want to give a little bit of background because the Calvin report was adopted by the University of Chicago in 1967. And so people might ask, what was going on in 1967? Um, so in 1967, as everybody does no doubt know, was the height of the Vietnam War. So I found an article written in the Chicago Maroon, which is the campus newspaper at University of Chicago, looking back 66 marked student sit-in at admin building, written by Hassan Ali. Um, so just a few years ago was the 40th anniversary of a 3-day sit-in at the university in which 450 students shut down the administration building to protest the university's Vietnam War draft policy. The protest, which took place, marked the culmination of nearly 3 months of growing concerns over new government standards in the draft for the Vietnam War. The Selective Service summoned colleges and universities nationwide to release grade point averages and class ranks of its students in an effort to classify academic performance for draft eligibility. So then, so under a previous policy, students were eligible for deferments until they completed their degree requirements or turned 24 years old. The selective service proposal, however, revoked deferments from students from in the bottom half of their class and made them eligible for the draft. And I did look into this because I was a little bit like, did that actually happen? Meaning, like, were students in the bottom half of their class or at failure of like not passing, did they actually get drafted? And it did. It did happen. And So, anyways, there was a lot of organization protests. Students for Democratic Society, SDS, was a big part of this. Um, they talk about how grading was inaccurate to wild at best. It's fascinating. It reminded me that it was only a few years before I started going to school. I went to Bowdoin College, and they had, I think, until the 90s, maintained only a pass-fail policy. And I'd forgotten, but the whole reason for that was this. They wanted to they created a grading policy that would limit the ability of selective service to pull their students out for the draft. And so there was a whole movement around this as one aspect of the the protests that took place on college campuses around the Vietnam War. So um, it says, while tensions in students and the administration between students and the administration remained high after the protests. This was after the occupation of the building, which it was important to note. Um, the students took direct action without any punishment, and it had been publicized its cause beyond anything imaginable by other less dramatic methods, right? So again, the effectiveness of a campus occupation, the very important history of this in actually getting the college to not only discipline those involved in the sit-in, but in 1967, the administration decided it would not disclose class ranks and grades to the selective service, right? So anyways, the discussion, the U of C protests prompted similar sit-in movements at the University of California, Berkeley later in 66, and by 68 was the main form of protest on at least 65 campuses, according to Sale. Sale is an SDS veteran. Um, the realization of complicity on the part of the university, combined with the realization of how readily it could be confronted, was a crucial element in helping turn attention back to the campus during the rest of the year. Um, so, anyways, I just think that this is very important context because the Kalven report comes out in 1967, right? So it comes out at a time when what is being questioned in terms of the role of the institution is its relationship to the government, to the draft, to selective service, and University of Chicago, which is it's promoted all kinds of horrible stuff, right? Neoliberalism, Milton Friedman, like all kinds of really bad stuff. Um, but they took this stand, right, to meet the demands of their students. They didn't discipline them, and they agreed not to cooperate with the United States government on the draft in terms of providing them information about their students, right? So this is so I don't know fully the connection between the Kalven report, right, and this stance, right? I couldn't quite find something, and I haven't done there's books about the Kalven report, and there's discussions about free speech, and I think it's either his daughter or his son has continued on the work of, I think he's Henry Kalven. I could be butchering all of this, but anyways, to think about free speech, and I'm not a huge free speech warrior. Let's just put it that way. Although I would like more free speech on this platform so that we could actually say what tell the truth about what's happening in Palestine and so on. And often I find that this platform doesn't like it when we do that. Uh, Africa Stream doesn't have free speech right now, right? Um, so we'll leave free speech discussion for another day. But the interesting thing about this Calvin report, which ACTA is encouraging everybody to adopt, which we'll go through in a minute, it's short, um, is that it comes about and it's about institutional neutrality, but it comes about in a time when neutrality might mean we're not working with the government, right? We're not going along with these uh these political pressures, right? Um to push us to hand over our students' grades. Now, I don't know, maybe that's not what the intent was, but I just think it's important. It also, the other aspect of it is that the free speech movement in the 60s was very much about students being able to promote radical ideas and about anti-Vietnam protests in large part. And so institutional neutrality also would mean, as they get to in the thing, that the university is not going to take a public position on this, but by doing so, we're going to allow all of our students the ability to express their politics however they want, right? Um, so, anyways, I find that interesting that this is now the context in which Calvin is referenced. Let me see. Here we go. All right, I'm gonna pull up Calvin. How do I hide the notes? All right. So yeah, so even here, so the committee was appointed on February 67. So actually, I think before the committee is appointed as they're still deciding their formal policy on the grade thing, right? Um, So this committee was asked to prepare a statement on the university's role in political and social action. Um, so it's interesting. It has reviewed the experience of the university in such matters as its participation in neighborhood redevelopment, right? Gentrification, its defense of academic freedom in the Broyles Bill inquiry of the 1940s. I don't actually know what that is in reference to. It might be interesting. And again, in the Jenner Committee hearings of the early 1950s. Its opposition to the disclaimer affidavit in the National Defense Education Act of 1958, its reappraisal of the criteria by which it rents off-campus housing it owns, and its position on furnishing the rank of male students to selective service. So again, like this is the context, right? It'd be interesting to look at some of these other contexts. I mean, a lot of this also has to do perhaps with McCarthyism. Uh, but, it basically it's asking them to define some of its positions. By design and by effect, it is the institution which creates discontent with the existing social arrangements and proposes new ones. In brief, a good university like Socrates will be upsetting, right? Again, this is actually not calling for, I mean, one, this is kind of like this classical liberal, like, you know, crap, really. But like on the other end, it's talking about creating discontent with existing social arrangements and proposing new ones, right? So again, it's kind of interesting to have these, to have ACTA using this document against students promoting their own political ideology, quote unquote. Um, Yeah, so anyways, it talks about a university must sustain an extraordinary environment of freedom of inquiry and maintain an independence from political fashions, passions, and pressures. A university, if it is to be true to its faith in intellectual inquiry, must embrace and be hospitable to and encourage the widest diversity of views within its own community. It is not, it is a community, but only for the limited, albeit great purposes of teaching and research. It is not a club, it is not a trade association, and it is not a lobby, right? So again, this gets to the kind of how they use it to depoliticize the positions that a university should take. There's no mechanism by which it can reach a collective position without inhibiting the full freedom of dissent on which it thrives. It cannot insist that all of its members favor a given view of social policy if it takes collective action. Therefore, it does so at the price of censuring any minority who does not agree with the view adopted. Um, So yeah, in brief, it is a community which cannot resort to a majority vote to reach positions on public issues. So again, I mean, this is very interesting. On one end, it's saying that the university has to remain quote unquote neutral, right, to allow for the full freedom of dissent and critique, right, which is the role of the university, um, but that it can't take any positions, right, and that it can't be democratic, right? Which I think is a fascinating piece of this as well. Um, yeah, I mean, anyways, you get at the point right here. This neutrality as an institution has its complement in the fullest freedom for its faculty and its students as individuals to participate in political action and social protests, right? So I think this is a really important aspect of this, though, because that's not what's happening, right? There's not their students and faculty are not being allowed to engage in um, you know, the fullest freedom of political action and social protest. They're actually advocating for all of these restrictions on those things. Then this is an interesting part. So from time to time, instances will arise in which the society or segments of it threaten the very mission of the university and its values of free inquiry. In such a crisis, it becomes the obligation of the university as an institution to oppose such measures and actively defend its interests and its values. So they take this, right? The ACTA takes this sentence to say, or these two sentences, right, to say, okay, there's an affront to the very values of the university that is the Palestinian liberation struggle, essentially, right? Like, I mean, that's what it comes down to. Um, that the movement for Palestinian liberation, right, because it is an anti-Zionist movement, because it challenges the state of Israel, right, so called, um, that this is actually the thing that's creating the threat that then has to be managed. Um, and I mean, this is like a kind of a classic, like all of this comports really well with counterinsurgency, right? This sort of general liberal theory of, you can have protest, you can have dissent. We want civil discourse, we want debate, right? But nobody's actually able to change the politics of the thing, right? Or to, uh, to go after the investments of it, right? Which, um, I don't think. Yeah, that's the other interesting part here, right? Is that there is no discussion of divestment within this document, and that's something I wanted to talk about a little bit because, to me, if an institution is to be neutral, right, it can't be invested in the thing that it's supposed to have neutrality on, right? So, like, for an institution to be neutral, you can't have large investments in weapons manufacturers and have your endowment and your fiduciary responsibility tied to these things. Um, and so, in a lot of ways, I think Calvin's an interesting place. Uh, it has these real problems because of the kind of libertarian framework that it's working within. But this issue of neutrality, I actually think is an interesting space for people to potentially think about organizing, right? Because I believe that you would have to do divestment to be neutral. Um, at what they don't like is the can of worms that this all opens up, and they especially don't like because they're quite clear that their project is to protect the state of Israel, right? Like, and this is again, this is why I entitled it Capital, right? Like, these are interests about it's kind of twofold. It is the capitalist interests of, all of these institutions have relationships with weapons manufacturers and, Boeing and Raytheon and, in the 60s, it was Dow Chemical that was being heavily protested because of its development of napalm and so on. But nowadays, that what we have is the military industrial complex in its really real form, which a lot of these universities are directly a part of. I mean, a lot there's no it's very interesting. I haven't yet found anything within any of these documents that talks about that. And maybe because they haven't figured out yet how they want to address it. But like, I think it's Penn that has the Ghost Robotics program, or maybe it's Drexel, one of the two. I think it's Penn. But there all of these colleges, especially the big research institutions, they're doing research alongside the Department of Defense and with these weapons manufacturers and so on. And so to think that they're neutral, right, when they have these relationships is actually it's just insane. And it's a myth anyways. I mean, it's like this whole thing of like objectivity within media, right? Like, everybody has things that they believe. Those beliefs, you know, they they inform what we say and what we think, and to think otherwise is just it's a fool's errand ultimately. Um but nonetheless, like, I do think there are some interesting things around the campus and neutrality, right? Because I do think if campuses were to be entirely politicized, which they're being heavily politicized by the right, by ACTA, and by all kinds of right wing forces, right? They would probably be even more hostile than they already are to left wing ideas within our society. And we see that with these groups that are trying to gut, the humanities and the social sciences and so on. Like, really, this is like a crusade against, settler colonial studies, decolonial studies, Marxism in the schools, like whatever vestiges of any of that exists, it's an attack on those things. Um, and again, like, ACTA is a part of that. This is their crusade against woke ideology, so called, right? I'm using that in scare quotes, but they actually use that term. Um, all right. Let me pull up their thing on divestment really quick. All right. I love the titles of their things too. It's like so like straightforward. Danger in divestment, the boycott, divestment, sanction movement. What college trustees need to know. Right. So I say again, they don't beat around the bush at all. It's not like, hey, we're against divestment on environmental stuff. They do reference that, of course, but like, no, the big concern here is BDS. Again, they have beautiful pictures of solid college encampments. Um, Again, yeah, colleges and universities face renewed danger in the coming academic year. Again, this also came out in August, right? So both of these came out in August. Um, Again. Their demands focus on Israel. If a precedent of capitulation to divestment pressure succeeds now, schools can be assured will be subject to other similar tactics for other socio-political causes. I mean, again, it's interesting because there's been environmental divestment movements for a long time. There've been, prison industrial complex divestment movements, right? So this is not it's, I mean, BDS has been around for a long time, but they're just now putting this out. Started 20 years ago. Unsavory ties to terrorist activity and overt anti-Semitism, right? So right out the gate, they go there. Um, they talk about how the campus occupations were month in the planning. And their evidence of that again is like how-to guides circulating on social media and stuff, um, as well as people wearing masks and breaking into buildings. But the senior administrators were largely taken by surprise. It is arguable that those demanding negotiations with their schools over divestment and boycott measures have used the process as a delaying tactic to avoid consequences for their unlawful activities. What is worse, some institutions made concessions to the demonstrators in return for their agreement not to disrupt commencement or to remove their tents. So again, I mean, they're all about civil discourse and dialogue, right? And that's always what they try to use to actually disrupt the encampments and so on. Um, but they actually are chastising here the universities for engaging in negotiations and not just, crushing the protests. This brief guide will explain why an educational institution should adopt a position of strict institutional neutrality. Again, it references the Kalven report. Institutional neutrality empowers colleges and universities to pursue their true mission of teaching and research rather than serving as a largely ineffective and marginal political platform. Such policy protests and fosters the freedom of expression and freedom of thought that are the lifeblood of liberal education, and it allows the institution to invest its funds subject only to financial professionals whose duty is to look after the strength of its portfolio as fiduciaries of the institution. Moreover, trustees who make decisions about the portfolio on grounds other than the best financial practice could even be personally held liable for breach of fiduciary responsibility. This is something that comes up. This is something that people are brought up is in the idea, just for people who don't understand, is that fiduciaries are supposed to only act in the best financial interest of the university. The argument is like pulling funds out of one thing costs fees and you have to reinvest otherwise. I mean, I think it's a pretty weak argument, especially because some of the stocks that are associated with Israel, I mean, obviously there's different, but like I think Elbit has like really tanked, you know what I mean? And so it's not necessarily that you can make a strong case that it's a sound financial decision to be, especially when you throw in, genocide, but you know, anyway, that's the logic that they use, right? I know there are some people out there that are doing work to try to speak to that fiduciary argument to suggest that it's not the best fiduciary duty, but it's ultimately just kind of an excuse. Now they could get sued, right? Because Zionists could engage in lawfare, but um, yeah. The boycott, divestment, sanction movement is an entirely appropriate topic for debate and discussion in relevant history and political science classes, along with such matters as the two-state solution, Zionism, and the history of the Middle East. But divestment and boycott of Israel is not even remotely a topic that should come before the governing board of a college or university. Again, recommendations: adopt the Kalven report, review it. Um, for the health of the endowment, the political climate on campus, and the flourishing of the university commitment, asserting institutional neutrality now and rejecting offers to divest from Israel make good sense for the university trustees. A good point on divestment, too, that I forgot to mention. So, um, tons and tons and tons of schools divested from apartheid holdings, right? And there was fiduciary responsibilities at that time, too. And one of the institutions that did not was the University of Chicago, which had adopted the Calvin Report, right? And so, this could be the reactionaries learning from past struggles, right? But that's just an important point to bring up, that U Chicago didn't divest, was one of the few, I don't want to say one of the few, but um it was marginal in that sense, among like universities. Reject calls for formal board consideration of divestment from Israel. Recognize that divestment is a threat to the university's mission and its financial health. I mean, that alone, that's quite a statement, right? Because, um, if you think divesting from Israel is a threat to your mission and your financial health, then that says that your university is Zionist, right? As an institution. I mean, that's a political alignment. And that's the thing. This is the thing about these arguments too, to me, is like you're saying you don't want to be political, but you want to be invested in Zionism and genocide, right? And in weapons manufacturing and war, right? And so it's again, it's this thing, right, of the separation of economics from politics, which has happened within capitalist society, sort of, right? Because obviously we know that politics in our society does have a strong role to play in our economics, but the the this is like one of those liberal myths. It's a neoliberal myth, really, more than anything, um, that you have to allow the market, free market, to do its own thing, right? And you don't make any political decisions about your economics, right? And so this can allow you to invest in anything. And I mean, frankly, it's going to kill the planet, right? I mean, this is one of the problems of capitalism, and you know stock market and all of that shit. Because if you're that invested in, by that logic, you would never divest from fossil fuels. You would never transition to, green energy. Um, so this is one of the things that they use, right? They use the words of Omar Barghouti, quote, "A Jewish state in Palestine in any shape or form cannot but contravene the basic rights of the indigenous Palestinian population and perpetuate a system of racial discrimination that ought to be opposed categorically." I mean, that's just fundamentally true, but that's what they're using, right? Because they're saying that ultimately BDS's aim is the end of a Jewish state in Israel, right? And again, like the language again for a nonprofit organization that's lobbying trustees to be this open in their language of thinking about a Jewish state, right? They're not even just saying like, you know, could there be, and I'm not advocating this, right? But there's not a discussion of, you know, of the fact that Israel is a Jewish state, right? And that is inherently creates these structures of apartheid on occupied Palestinian land, right? Um, it's just quite bold in its politics, in its ideology that it's seeking to promote upon the universities, right? Um, they do. There's a big part about the academic boycott too. The goal of isolating and delegitimizing Israel is most clearly evident in BDS's pursuit of academic boycotts, a goal that is even in the name of its forerunner, formed 20 years ago, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACB. And PACB is still around, right? And it's an academic and cultural boycott. And yeah, there's a whole I'm not going to get into it, but there's a whole thing in here about why they shouldn't do that. um what is of primary interest of pro-Palestine groups that demonstrate for BDS is undercutting the moral legitimacy of Israel. That is a political goal, and that within an even larger opposition to the West, right? Mr. Barghouti articulated in 2011, BDS will unavoidably contribute to the global social movement's challenge to neoliberal Western hegemony and the tyrannical rule of multi-transnational corporations, right? So again, like they're posting this like it's a bad thing. Like that's a great statement. Who wants neoliberal Western hegemony and the tyrannical rule of multi-transnational corporations? We're supposed to believe that that's a good thing. Um, Then they do the terrorism connection. They don't really give any, good citations of that, but, that's Israel considers every Palestinian political organization that's not, subsumed within the Palestinian Authority, it considers them terrorist organizations. So, I mean, they consider UNRWA a terrorist organization, right? Um They cite the Anti-Defamation League, of course, which is not a serious institution. But I found this interesting. They talk about the Anti-Defamation League, uh, talked about how some SJP chapters, it's also an attack on SJP, this whole document, issued pro-Hamas messaging and or promoted violent anti-Israel propaganda social media accounts. The University of Illinois SJP chapter shared a video which shows what appears to be a Hamas terrorist filming himself from inside the home of an Israeli family during the attack. At least 3 chapters referred readers to the Resistance News Network. Yeah, people should follow the Resistance News Network. I'm with that. Part of an encrypted messaging application that shares violent images and videos of attacks on Israelis and disseminates Hamas propaganda. Since the Hamas attack, 5 others routinely shared RNN content even before October 7th, 2023. Um, I don't understand why that's important that it was before that. It seems like whatever. Um, So yeah, the why they should reject demands for divestment from Israel. The number one reason is the BDS is anti-Semitic, right? That's their their go-to. They do talk about the State Department's policy on anti-Semitism now. They cite Larry Summers, who's a former who's a gov- US, he's a George W. Bush administration official and former Harvard president. Terrible, terrible human being. Um, they talk about the scores of Title VI complaints submitted to the Department of Education, which provide incontrovertible evidence of the depths and magnitudes that anti-Semitism and harassment of Jewish students have reached on campuses nationwide. I'll just say that most of the complaints of Title VI are about Zionists being uncomfortable with anti-Zionism on their campuses. That is what is being used to leverage that particular narrative. Academic boycott of Israel is illegitimate and violates academic ethics. Um, they also talk about how SJP is also has relationships with terrorist organizations, which is not surprising. I mean, it's not true, but it's not surprising that they would say that. State and national legislative initiatives reject BDS. So this is again, there's all kinds of lawfare that has been done. Currently, 28 states have passed legislation in opposition to the BDS movement, prohibiting state agencies from contracting with companies that boycott Israel. With several other states considering similar measures, 6 other states have enacted anti-BDS executive orders. I mean, first of all, that's insane that that many states have capitulated to the lobbying of Zionists. But again, it shows the fundamental nature of how the United States views Israel, both as this defense of Western civilization and against Arab people and the East, but also, the the role that it plays in liquidating, left-wing movements, anti-imperialist movements, and the role it plays as a depot for weapons manufacturers to send billions and billions of dollars of weapons. Um, Institutional neutrality, negotiation with students about divestment from Israel or from any other nation, industry, or business should be off the table. Again, so this is what they're trying to say is they're trying to make sure that universities have policies or adopt policies that basically remove divestment from discussion. Um, Boards that erode this firewall will now fight new fires indefinitely. We don't take a position on foreign policy. This is from Vanderbilt Chancellor. University of Chicago. Over more than a century, through a great deal of vigorous debate, the university has adopted a consensus against taking social or political stances on issues outside of its core mission. Again, University of Chicago agreed with students not to submit grades to the draft board. So if that's not a political or social issue, I don't really know what is. Anyways, I think I'm gonna close that there and see if there's any questions. Which states? Well, it's 28 of them. I mean, there's actually a map of it out there somewhere that we could probably find, but it's a lot, majority, and a lot of times it takes different forms. I don't know that it's necessarily, you know, you could have a policy that said that you were going to divest from weapons manufacturers, right? That wouldn't necessarily divest from Israel, right? So I don't think even in a state where it exists that it should preclude activists and organizers from trying to be creative if they want to pursue this divestment agendas. Um, you know, so yeah. It is like a college version of ALEC. I mean, this is, anyway, let's see. Just looking through the chat a little bit, see if there's questions. Um, Does Renee Johnson have a spreadsheet of that? She probably will by this Saturday. So yeah, the DEI thing I think is an interesting point. Um, Totally silent on police attacks on students and on BDS. So like on one end, there's this interesting trend that started with especially George Floyd, right, where all institutions felt this need to make statements. And I actually found it, and this is the thing I've talked with Fred Moten about it on a couple of our conversations, because we ended up talking about that in the two-part discussion we had with him in 2020. And then again, pretty soon after, I think October 18th was our conversation, right after October 7th. And, in both cases, he had this real frustration. He's like, I don't want my president speaking for me. Like, I don't want these statements. Like, what is the point of these statements? And I think I also, obviously, I speak on political and social issues all the time. So I don't want to discourage people from making statements. But my college, my my job, my corporation, my kid's school superintendent. Like, I actually don't, when they make political statements, it's always bad. I don't want them to, right? So that's where actually with the Kalven thing, I kind of actually agree on one level, because part of what they're using Calvin for is to say the university shouldn't make the political statement. The problem I have is how then broad they're taking it, because the political the them issuing these statements, which most of their statements, to be clear, since October 7th have been condemning Palestinian protesters. That's what most of college universities have been making statements on since then, or pro-Palestinian protesters. But the but there's this insidious way, right, where it sort of vacates any idea of political or social responsibility, that the university has then no, um it owes nothing to the community, it owes nothing to the neighborhood. This is how they can justify and defend their logics of gentrification and endless land grabs. It's a vacation. It's vacating the universities of any sort of moral or ethical code. Um, and if they had a moral ethical code, we might not like it, which is the tricky thing about that. Um, but I think that for students and faculty and people that work in these places, that that is an important side of struggle, right? Is to try to, as best they can, make universities either, um, be the places that students and faculty want them to be, right? But also to embody some form of ethical principles. I mean, academics have to follow certain codes of ethics. They teach people how to be accountants. Accountants have a set of ethics. Lawyers have a set of ethics, right? So, um, yeah, I mean, we might not like a lot of those things and the way that they're um they're laid out, but I think that there's a real problem in the way that they're weaponizing this neutrality, right? Because real neutrality, you get to neutrality, like the kind of some of the history of it. I mean, I think about Ireland and neutrality, and it's not a perfect past there, and but there's but it becomes a place for conversation, right? Because then if like NATO jets are refueling on Shannon Airport, or the US is doing stuff like that, it becomes actually a topic of debate within their society of like, should we be allowing this to happen? Is even that a level of involvement, a violation of our principles of neutrality? There was a whole thing, and I don't know where they landed on this, because I think there was some people in Ireland were trying to get Ireland to join NATO after the war in Ukraine started. I don't think that they ultimately ended up doing so, but that's a you know, but my point being is that if you look historically at that stance of Ireland, it has been basically like, we've been colonized. Our history has been, that wars have not been in our interests, and we don't want to be a part of the oppression of other colonized people on behalf of, the UK or other, you know, um, and so again, it's not perfect, right? There's definitely plenty to critique within Irish history around this, but it's at least an attempt to sort of actually be neutral in terms of war, right? And that's not what the university is saying, right? That's not what ACTA is saying. They're saying, no, we should be pro-imperialists in terms of war. We should be pro-Israel in terms of war. We should be anti-Palestinian, right? And so I just think that's an important thing, again, of that the interest of that focus on neutrality is that this will be, something that you will see, if those of you who are on college campuses and stuff and in other educational settings, you will see institutions trying to leverage that. And I do think that, um, one, challenging and demystifying that idea that, there really isn't neutrality is one aspect of it. But also there's another angle there, I think, potentially, that if institutions really want to be neutral, then they should be neutral, right? They should divest themselves the from war, right? On a minimum, right? Um, and that's not, obviously that's not Palestinian liberation, it's not whatever, but it might be a different line of, um I want to say attack, but another line of struggle that you could engage in on a university campus, right, is to actually think about this idea of neutrality and how this bullshit version of neutrality is actually not living up to it as any sort of reasonable principle. Um, because just how can you be neutral in something that you're invested in? How can you be neutral in something that you are funding, that you're building weapons for or doing research for? Um, that's not actually any form of real neutrality. Um, so yeah, I think that's pretty much all I had. Um, there was a whole like short video on what a culture of free expression looks like. Maybe I will show that one real quick because it's kind of funny. It's like two. Um, Let me see if I can pull this up real quick. So this is just kind of funny. This is their video on how they promote free expression on college campuses. Again, this is like the free speech warrior thing I was talking about at the beginning.
Violations of freedom of expression are surging on America's college campuses. ACTA, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, is working to reverse this dangerous trend. ACTA's gold standard for freedom of expression provides a blueprint for building a positive, open campus culture for generations to come. Until recently, higher education was regarded as our nation's greatest sanctuary for the free exchange of ideas. But many of today's colleges and universities have become hostile to civil discourse. Recent polls show that students are reluctant, even fearful, to share their views on campus. Controversial speakers are often canceled or shouted down. We are providing colleges and universities with concrete steps they can take to affirm their commitment to civil discourse and academic freedom. We urge all college leaders to adopt and live by the Chicago Principles on Freedom of Expression. We advocate training for students, faculty, and administrators to maintain and foster a culture of free expression. These values need to be clear in official codes of conduct, student and faculty handbooks, and student orientations. We recommend that all universities maintain institutional neutrality in the face of pressure to take public positions on political, social, and cultural issues of the day. We bring debates to campuses, hosting public speakers who offer challenging ideas, modeling a commitment to open dialogue, and applying significant consequences for those who engage in shoutdowns, disinvitations, or disruptions. We believe that all students deserve faculty and classrooms that represent a broad spectrum of viewpoints. We strongly oppose using intellectual litmus tests or forced statements when hiring, evaluating, and promoting college faculty. Join ACTA's Campus Freedom Initiative. Free your campus, free your mind.
It's crazy, right? So anyway, yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things there is I highly doubt that they would promote like real debate or dialogue on that. I mean, they say that they would, but what? I just had to make people watch. It's only 2 minutes. I had to make people watch a little bit of like who these people are. Um, anyway, the other thing I'll say, just to go back to the beginning, is that video with Bernard Henry Levy or Henri, I don't know, I don't care. Um, uh, is interesting in itself to watch. And again, people can find that on their YouTube page. Um, just because like at one point in it, the guy who's the president of ACTA says, we had John Bolton here a couple weeks ago, and don't you think he was a little better on foreign policy in dealing with these Palestinians? I mean, that's a paraphrase, but he did say like we invited John Bolton to um I'm assuming he's saying the synagogue. I don't know if this was also an ACTA thing. That would be interesting too. If it was, I would like to watch that one. But um just the whole it's quite wild to me how open they are with their views, and that this has such a wide range. Or let me see if I can find that, because there was somewhere where it talked about how many campuses. I don't know, I can't find it now, but they, like I said, it's something like 1,600 colleges and universities have some form of relationship with this group. Um, so I think that it's not a coincidence that these two documents get published on their website. Again, all this stuff is public. They do private trainings, which that would be really fascinating to see if you could. Um, but that this stuff comes out in August, and then like everybody I know who works in higher education, which I know a lot of people from doing this podcast mostly, they've received some form of, and often all of these policies, right? Sort of rolled out on their campuses. And so yeah, it's yeah, for folks who don't know John Bolton, I mean, death squads, right? He's like one of the most ghoulish people in the history of this country, which is not a low bar. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to hear their again their politics sort of so public, when most of the time within the nonprofit sphere, if anything, I mean, I guess I just say it again, like the contradiction of being advocating institutional neutrality and advocating that these institutions are politically neutral and don't take issues on political, social, or cultural issues, when all that their website is about, the whole thing is about taking stances on political, social, and cultural issues. I mean, that's what it is. It's about a promotion of a certain kind of like liberal to libertarian ideology on college campuses, and to create policies that defend the institutions for defending um, those ideological, political, social, cultural positions, right? So anyway, all right. But the point that brought up about DEI that I did want to go back to, I think that's interesting, because I think what's happening with that counterinsurgency, like, you had DEI become a very prominent response to the George Floyd movement, before that earlier phases of Black Lives Matter, right? So this was in many ways a way for universities. It'd be interesting to see whether um, ACTA actually promoted that at some point. That would be really fascinating. I kind of doubt it, but it's possible. But to have these different mechanisms, right, to then create spaces for people to deal with all kinds of stuff that people were feeling, and I still do feel, right, about like the ongoing, it's not a legacy, the ongoing history, the living history of anti-Black violence and racism, um, or the marginalization of LGBT folks, right? And so DEI spaces were often created within universities to try to kind of really provide some level of space, but actually diffuse organizing and movements associated with those things, right? To actually kind of bog it down and give it institutional processes it had to go through and so on. But what's fascinating is that now they're like, well, the group that we can't fit into that is the settlers. Like, what do we do about the settlers and the Zionists? Like, how do we protect their rights, right? It makes sense again that a group that was these free speech warriors that was trying to get right-wing folks on campuses and stuff like that would again align on those kind of politics. But you will see this interesting thing because the right obviously is against DEI for a different reason. They don't want diversity, right? They don't want they when they talk about DEI, they're usually what they're just talking about is like a a person of color in a prominent position. Like that's what it means to them. And so for them, it's often just a dog whistle of like we need more whiteness. Um, but you have in so anyways, I mean, and that's interesting too, right? In light of Jewish students, most of whom are white, right? Um, so yeah. Anyway, that's enough. I've rambled enough. I appreciate your time. Please make sure to take a minute and support if you so please share the conversation, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. We're really close to 8,000 subscribers. And tomorrow we have a conversation I'm very much looking forward to. We're going to talk about the new book, Abolish Rent, which I've read. It's excellent. And uh, yes, this is correct. This is what they say. Appreciate you all, and we'll be back with you tomorrow.